Good morning. It is Monday, November 16, 2015. This is a special edition following the deadly terror attacks in Paris over the weekend. Coming up today, French security officials are on the hunt for a man believed to be directly involved in the Friday night Paris terror attacks, who was originally detained after the attack but later released. France bombs the Syrian city of Raqqa, targeting ISIS camps in its strongest airstrike in weeks and inside the embattled Middle East nation as retaliation for Friday attacks. And following the Paris attacks on Friday, world leaders meeting in Turkey for the G20 summit focus on the battle against the Islamic group and the refugee crisis, of course. Good morning, I'm Yael Avi, and this is a special morning edition. We begin, of course, in France, where authorities are still on the hunt for a suspect thought to be directly involved in Friday's terror rampage, and which claimed the lives of at least 132 people. French police issued an alert and released a photo of Salah Abdeslam, describing him as 26 years old and dangerous. Two of Salah's brothers are thought to have died after participating in the attacks at the Bataclan concert hall, which left, of course, at least 89 dead. That was the worst scene of the terror attacks on Friday. Salah himself was reportedly detained after the attacks, but released shortly after, and now the manhunt is on. The remaining 7 gunmen, all of whom were wearing suicide vests packed with explosives, died in multiple assaults. Now, the well-planned and executed attacks claimed by the Islamic State terror group have placed Europe as a whole in a state of high alert. French President François Hollande said he will extend the state of emergency for another 3 months. Neighboring Belgium and the UK also heightened their alert levels and raised security presence in public places. While Paris is coming to grips with the tragedy, the leaders of the G20 group of developed nations are meeting in Turkey for a summit. Fighting terror features prominently on the conference's agenda, and the leaders already released a draft document on border controls and aviation security. In addition, the U.S. and France have agreed to intensify airstrikes against the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. Now, we are joined in studio by former Israeli ambassador to France, Ambassador Daniel Sheikh. Good morning to you. Yeah. With us also, senior researcher at the International Institute for Counterterrorism at the IDC, Dr. Amichai Magen. Good morning to you. Yeah. And Russia Today Middle East Bureau Chief with us as well, Paula Slier. Good morning to you.
Hi.
Before anything else, let's take a look at the following report about the latest coming out of Paris and the ongoing investigation, and then break it down.
Tonight, an international manhunt for a suspected terrorist who authorities say was one of the gunmen in the Paris attacks. 26-year-old Salah Abdeslam, born in Brussels. Officials tell ABC News that he is one of 3 brothers. One brother died during the massacre, and the other was detained in Belgium. Authorities say Salah Abdeslam is dangerous, and they warn the public not to approach him under any circumstances. He's believed to be the gunman who led the team shooting at people in restaurants and bars in Paris, authorities tell ABC News tonight. Police picked up his escape trail in a suburb just outside of Paris after they found a car that had been used in the attack. And they believe he then took a different car to Brussels. En route, he was pulled over at a traffic stop, but not detained, and he made it across the border. Authorities later seized that car in Belgium. Now, the focus of this intense investigation here in Molenbeek, a poor suburb of Brussels plagued by radicalism.
The streets of this neighborhood are full of Arabic restaurants and grocers and butchers, and it's one of the neighborhoods that has sent more jihadi fighters to Syria and Iraq than any other place in Europe.
7 arrests here yesterday. A chaotic scene as one man was pinned over a wall and arrested outside a subway station, officers with guns drawn standing by. But tonight, Salah Abdeslam is still on the loose.
Let's go straight to Paris first, where we're going to I-24 News Europe correspondent Jonathan Sachadati standing by. Jonathan, good morning to you. Where do we stand on this manhunt of, what is becoming quite a terrifying story? An 8th assailant and on the run. Where does the manhunt stand? What do we know?
Good morning, Yael. Well, here we can see the newspapers already coming out this morning talking about Hollande's reaction, and we saw that reaction kick into place last night. Already we've seen increased bombing of Raqqa in Syria by the French. We saw 12 planes, 10 fighter jets doing this. This is a clear signal that when he said that the reaction would be pitiless, he meant it. And then that manhunt that you mentioned. The shocking news that the French authorities actually stopped and questioned one of the suspects and then let him go on when he was in a car carrying 3 people near the border with Brussels. This is believed to be the man who had rented the Volkswagen Polo, which was used in the attack on the Bataclan, where the highest number of casualties was registered in Friday night's coordinated attacks. And then during the course of last night, we saw those raids taking place across France in this coordinated anti-terror manhunt. We had raids in Bobigny, which is a suburb north of Paris, in Toulouse in southwest France, and also in Grenoble in southeast France, with arrests being made and dozens of police raiding houses.
Now, Jonathan, you've been there for several days, and we're looking at the manhunt and police looking into houses. That said, the feeling in the streets of Paris this morning, the feeling when it comes to the security of the civilians of Paris, the civilians of Europe in that respect.
There's a mixture of feelings here, as you would expect. Some people are afraid and some people are angry. Others are resilient, saying that France will not be cowed by this sort of attack. You saw last night those 2 false alarms. We were reporting live on the channel just last night as the scene was evacuated where we were outside the Bataclan. And then here, where I am now in the Place de la République, there was also an evacuation, a stampede of people who'd come here to gather to pay their respects to the dead, suddenly leaving when the police announced that there had been a potential shooting. Those shootings turned out to be false alarms, firecrackers, but that just showed the state of high tension that was going on. So French people are still very afraid. The instructions last night were still to stay at home. And today schools are reopening. People are going back to life as much as they can, but things are certainly not returning to normal just yet.
Now, Jonathan, you mentioned at the beginning of this that indeed there was an overnight bombing of Raqqa by the French. Clearly, this seems to be, you know, Hollande's first act in retaliating against this heinous act in France. That said, are the calls in France for him to try and do something more?
Of course, and I mean the fear in France is also that in those regional elections coming up in just a short number of weeks, this could help provoke a swing to the far right. Victory for Marine Le Pen's party, because people will, they think, be divided, that the society will be reacting angrily against immigration, especially knowing that one of these killers was reported to have come through Greece posing as a refugee. So when we hear things like this, it's understandable that there is also a fear there, and Hollande feels the need to show his strength and in order to perhaps counter that swing to the far right.
Counter the swing to the far right. And clearly, Jonathan Satchadati, thank you. You will be back with us shortly from Paris, the scene of this incredibly heinous terrorist attack. Dr. Margan, actually, I want to start with you, because this morning, I think that one of the big stories coming out of Paris is the fact that there's a manhunt after an 8th assailant who supposedly, you know, managed to flee police. This act, I found it to be quite organized and well planned, and so it seemed. How is that missed in an environment where less than a year ago in Paris we saw the Charlie Hebdo shootings, we saw another terror attack a year has not passed, and this happens?
Yeah, so I think this this particular attack shows the enormous complexity of the reality that Europe is facing today. You saw it in the mix of assailants, right? You have native French-born attackers, you have people coming across the border from Belgium, you have supposedly at least one attacker who managed to use the asylum and the immigration route through Greece to make it to the scene of the attack. You see the complexity, and it is enormously complex. You essentially have these 3 moving pieces, and they're all influencing one another. There is Europe and the population in Europe. The vast majority of Muslims, of course, in Europe are not involved in this, but even if you have a tiny percentage of people who are, that's a big problem. Secondly, you have Syria and what's going on in Syria. and you have the fluidity and movement of foreign fighters from Europe to Syria and back. And thirdly, and very crucially, you have those connecting areas, particularly Turkey and the Balkans, that are facilitating the movement of these three scenes. So this is geographically large, complex. I'm not surprised that a particular assailant was missed when you had thousands and thousands of cars crossing the border. The problem is more structural. You do raise an important point, which is if we consider the Charlie Hebdo attacks almost a year ago to have been sort of an early warning of the degree of organization and sophistication. This should have been really a warning about the network, the infrastructure, the capabilities of jihadi groups in France. Almost a year later, it looks as if operationally there were few, sadly and tragically, few lessons drawn. And I suspect that in the aftermath of the 3 days of mourning, the immediate outpouring of sympathy and rallying behind François Hollande as the leader of France, there will be some very tough questions that are going to be asked about preparedness, about intelligence, and perhaps even some kind of national inquiry that would be similar to the 9/11 inquiry in the aftermath of the attacks then.
And speaking of François Hollande, Ambassador Sheikh, I'm a former Israeli ambassador to Paris, I'm asking you that because the second this happened, my main concern when I saw that was, oh my God, you know, what type of war are we going to see now? That said, Hollande did come out calling the ISIS attacks an act of war. It sounded like he's promising war. We see bombings over Raqqa in Syria. That said, we know that that's almost just like a continuation of what the French are doing, irrespective of whatever happened in France, in Paris. Can he do more?
Yes, and he probably will, but I think that you have to take a step back here and understand that retaliation, revenge are natural sort of knee-jerk reactions, and they need to be done, but they are not the main effort here. The idea is not to avenge the deaths of the far too many French people who died 48 hours ago, but to try and fight the infrastructure and where these attacks are coming from. And that needs a much more long-term and sophisticated effort, where France will have to play a central role, but it cannot play it alone. There needs to be a coalition here in order to fight the basis of ISIS. You know, they bombed Raqqa. It would be a bit naive to think that these guys have been sitting around and waiting for them. It's such an obvious target. But again, it needs to be done. Second point, I'm not here to defend the French intelligence services, but we do have to be fair. It's true that a year ago, there was Charlie Hebdo, and it's also certainly true that what happened 2 days ago represents a failure of the French intelligence. The thing is that we don't gather here around this table all year round to discuss the attacks that have been foiled, and there have been. I know for a fact that there have been successes. So it's a little bit unfair to, which is natural.
No,
we gather here when
actually you're raising on Friday.
And everybody knows, including of course the super people of counterterrorism here in Israel. We know that intelligence isn't foolproof. It's tragic, but that is the fact. Having said that, clearly, this is going to, this will have to create a sort of a bump in the effort, in the budgets, in the technologies, in the legislation that are at the service of the concerted military intelligence and police work that is needed in order to follow these thousands and thousands and thousands of potential targets who may one day turn into one of these 8 guys.
Or are using or using the people who are flowing into Europe as a disguise, as we saw.
Well, that's a different story, because here it's a huge story, by the way. It's very, very bad news for the migrants.
Exactly.
If that turns out to be true,
that's a terrifying thing.
I mean, with all the sympathy for them, you must understand that if it is true that as ISIS actually warned they would, to infiltrate these fluxes of migrants with their operatives, then there will have to be far more stringent screening of these migrants before they can enter the European territory.
Before they can enter the European territory. And speaking, though, of the root problem cause of all of this, as you mentioned, I asked about Hollande, what can he do? At the end of the day, right now, the people who are supposedly, and I'm going to use supposedly about anybody who's on the ground in Syria right now, fighting ISIS, are the Russians. And Paula Slayer, you just came back from Syria, correct?
Correct.
When it comes to the battle against ISIS, because at the end of the day, the core route is not in Europe. It's, Europe is the target. It's coming out of the Middle East. Are there gains against this group in Syria?
Well, they certainly are if you listen to what the Russian Defense Ministry are saying. Although I hear what the ambassador says, and, targeting Raqqa in one airstrike doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to take on the whole group in its entirety. I was at the Russian Air Force Base just outside the city of Latakia. I spent 3 days there. And what for me was particularly remarkable was an interview with the commander. He said, and I'm quoting him, that he was amazed by the amount of weapons that ISIS has in Syria. Now, during the period that I was there, we were witnessing almost every hour Su-24, 30s, 34s taking off. Just an aside that was quite moving for me is it's almost a custom amongst the Russian pilots before they climb into the planes, and we had close-up access to this. They would stroke the nose of the plane almost as a sign of comfort or good luck as they set off on their raids. But the information that they were giving us was that they believe they are hitting 90% of the infrastructure in Syria, but as I say, that they're amazed about the extent to which that infrastructure is. They also referenced intelligence that they were getting, interestingly enough, and this is a new development, from opposition. So there is coordination, not between opposition fighters, but between political opposition on the ground. Right. And I think that is an encouraging sign that you have this information center that's coming out of Baghdad that sees intelligence of Iraq, Iran, and Syria. And now the opposition are also coming to the fore. The Russians haven't since Friday made any more statements that they're going to be increasing their airstrikes in Syria, other than the Russian president giving condolences. They're still waiting, by and large, to see what is the findings of the downing of the Russian plane, although Western intelligence does suggest that 90% certainty that it was brought down by a bomb. And if indeed it was ISIS that was responsible to that, I think that will be the impetus, certainly for the Russians, to take on ISIS in greater measure. I just want to add one last note. After being in Syria, I spent a few days in Moscow, and the Russians are also on high alert. The Moscow police as they should be. There was a video that was released last week by ISIS before the French attacks, saying that they were going to take on the Kremlin. They specifically mentioned the Kremlin, and the Russians are taking those kind of warnings extremely seriously.
And sadly, when ISIS warns, as I said, sadly, it usually turns out to be true.
That's an important point just to say, because again, the retaliation is important. But if you're a neighboring country to France, if you're the UK, if you're Russia, now is the time to make sure that you're doing the job, because in order to avoid the attack, because there's no reason to think that there's a personal fight with France here. ISIS has said it clearly, and it also makes sense that anything in the Western world and Russia, for that matter, is a target.
So if anything, it points to the need for there to be greater coordination between the Russians and the Western powers in fighting Islamic State.
Apropos coordination, we're joined now from Paris by Christian Mallard, I-24 News contributor and senior reporter. Mr. Mallard, I want to thank you because I want to pose the same question.
Good morning, Well. Good morning.
Good morning. When it comes to this greater coordination, calls within France, are we looking at a possibility where the French are going to try and actually call for a bigger coalition, or themselves, I'm theorizing here, possibly think of sending, right now the Russians are the only ones in Syria with troops on the ground, so to speak. We're sending more people to fight ISIS at their core bases, which is the Middle East.
No, the French are not going to send troops on the ground. There is no way it was said again yesterday. The French will go on attacking, of course, Daesh, as they did last night, 20 bombings in Raqqa, because they do think that it's one of the top headquarters of Daesh in the area in Syria. And they do know that they have many young French boys or young adults which has been involved with Daesh in this area, and which job is to come and go between Syria and France and try to make terrorist attacks, as it was the case during the last 3 days last Friday. But at the same time, the French realize today, like the Russians, that we need to make a big coalition. This is the necessity to make this coalition, to have the Americans, the Russians, the French, and most of the country of the Western coalition to go together and try to eradicate Daesh. We heard a lot of military strategists saying that if we do that, and we have troops on the ground like the Iranians, the Iraqis, the Syrians, of course, on the ground, they said, quote, they can eradicate Daesh in 1 month. So why don't they do it? I think now it's clear that the time has come after what happened in Paris that everybody works together, all together, and tries to move forward. I got a note from the spokesman of President Putin, whom I know very well, Dmitry Peskov, sent me a note, and he said it was 2 days ago, there is no place for terrorists in our world, and we should stand together to get rid of them. I think he's right, and why now we don't go? I think the G20 summit, which is going on for an extra day today in Turkey, in Antalya, should be used for that by Obama and Putin and Monsieur Fabius, who is representing Monsieur Hollande, President Hollande, on the spot. And I think they should take drastic decisions to move forward that way.
That's the million-dollar question. Believe me, Mr. Millard, thank you for joining us this morning. Dr. Morgan, I'm asking you, when it comes to ISIS and this network of terrorists, it's only troops on the ground at this point that can stop it?
Well, I think the first thing to recognize is, a year and a half after President Obama promised to degrade and destroy ISIS and has built this grand coalition of 50 countries, the only international actor that so far made a real dent are the Russians. The problem is that this campaign is still very much half-hearted. Okay, let me explain why. First of all, there is a campaign in Syria, but there's no campaign in Iraq, which is ludicrous because the Islamic State views itself. It doesn't respect.
It's in their name. The Islamic State of Iraq
and Syria, and there's no Iraq campaign. Secondly, what we see is groups such as Ansar Bet el-Maqdis in Sinai, various groups that used to be affiliated with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, in the Sahel, in Libya, etc. They are joining the Islamic State. They are pledging allegiance to the Islamic State, and so now the extent of the Islamic State, as we saw with the downing of the Russian plane, presumably we shouldn't reach 100% conclusion, but more and more it looks as if this was a well-planned, coordinated ISIS attack from Sinai, which means that the epicenters of the Islamic State are metastasizing, and we have a proliferation of the problem. This is still a half-hearted campaign because there has still not been a very determined campaign against the revenue sources of ISIS, the oil wells, the transportation infrastructure, ransom. We haven't mentioned this, but the truth is that between 2008 and 2014, France alone paid nearly 60 million euros in ransom to release its nationals from ISIS. Europe paid over 200 million euros, not just the French, but the Germans and others, the Italians, to release their captured nationals. And so we are funding, Europe has been funding and feeding ISIS. And unless we deal with these structural causes, the airstrikes are only going to make a dent.
Speaking of those coalitions and what needs to be done, there's, in a bizarre turn of events, the G20 summit is taking place right now, actually, in Turkey, and that's following the terrorist, not following the terrorist, but came on the same time. Well, leaders are convening for the G20 summit, when basically the agenda now includes the attacks and their aftermath. And we'll also focus on the migrant crisis in the Middle East and Europe, which is directly connected to the same issue, of course. Let's take a look at the following report from Turkey and break it down.
In the aftermath of the series of dreadful attacks in Paris, world leaders have gathered in Ankara, Turkey, for the G20 summit.
The killing of innocent people based on a twisted ideology is an attack not just on France, not just on Turkey, but it's an attack on the civilized world.
It was also a good opportunity to strengthen relations between world powers. American President Barack Obama held a 30-minute meeting on the sidelines with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin, breaking the ice after months of disconnection between the two. According to officials, Obama and Putin agreed on the need for a Syria-led political transition, including UN-mediated talks.
We understand well that defeating the terror threat and helping millions of those who lost their homes is only possible by uniting the efforts of the whole international community.
The Paris attacks also cast a shadow over the Vienna talks, which took place over the weekend. Leaders at the summit there agreed on a series of actions to resolve the crisis in Syria and agreed to work towards setting a timetable for a credible, inclusive and non-sectarian transition government in Damascus within 6 months. However, officials in Syria dismissed the resolution.
Syrians are solely responsible for making the changes to techniques and structure. Nobody is allowed to put timetables, even if they're friends or enemies. They are not allowed to say what should be changed in Syria in the structure and techniques.
The deadly outrage in Paris created a new level of tension, and it is now clear that quick action to resolve the conflicts in the Middle East is crucial. Questions regarding how to tackle the issue, be it a surgical military operation, diplomacy, or strengthening Assad's forces, are still in dispute among the participants.
Joined from Istanbul by journalist Laura Wells. Laura, good morning to you.
Good morning.
When it comes to the G20 summit, obviously the only issue is most likely the terror attacks and ISIS. Any information gleaned, if we're going to look at any type of statements or any kind of resolution coming out of there for a coalition possibly or reaction?
Well, yesterday, President Erdogan had said that this is a collective fight against terrorism. Certainly, President Obama is keen to renew his fight on ISIS, which has not gone very well. And certainly the fact that President Hollande said that this was an act of war by ISIS, the terrible Paris attacks on Friday night, this could also trigger NATO to back up France in this, and it perhaps could launch a kind of war, and NATO might be declaring war on ISIS.
And declaring a war on ISIS. Speaking, though, when it comes to that war on ISIS, Paula Sleer next to me, the one interesting thing to me was out of the G20 summit is this tiny little meeting on the sidelines that I saw Obama and Putin basically sitting and huddling around. Are we looking possibly, do we think, any information, the Americans, other than just saying we're stepping up air campaigns, that there is a broader agenda on how to fight ISIS in Syria?
I think many people would hope that that's what would happen. The meeting that happened on the sidelines lasted only about half an hour, but what did come out of it was a recognition from both sides that there needs to be a United Nations mediation in terms of negotiations and a ceasefire, and both leaders saying that the move to a transitional government and to elections in the space of a year and a half needs to come from Syria grassroots. The sticking point still remains the sticking point, and that is whether or not the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad remains in power in Syria. And we saw the same kind of issue not being actually dealt with at the meeting in Vienna on Saturday. And so the Russians are still saying that Assad needs to be there, that it's the only way to stop an implosion per se. It's not that they're insisting that it's Assad per se, but they certainly want him there for the time being. But you, as we saw in that report, you have criticisms coming out from both these meetings with the Syrians and it's certainly the opposition saying, well, for as long as Assad remains part of this, there cannot be any step forward. So to answer your question more directly, I think the leaders feel there needs to be a coordination. Right. But the question of what happens with the Syrian president is still keeping them apart.
Yeah,
this once again strengthens Putin's hands. This attack in Europe strengthens Putin's hands because it makes stronger the Russian case that Assad and the Assad regime need to be maintained because the alternative is chaos. I think he has some of the Europeans already persuaded, and he's managing, and I think as a result of this attack, his ability to sort of play divide and rule between Europe and the United States on this is going to be stronger.
Thank you again. We're taking a short break. We'll be right back. Good morning, I-24 News Morning Edition. Ami, what day is it?
Oh, gee, I don't know. I'm totally confused.
It's completely.
It's the 16th of November.
It is the 16th of November, and it's been a very, very bloody weekend, sadly, all around Europe, but also in the Middle East. And we are actually getting reports of a raid overnight. These are raids that clearly are happening on a slightly faster level.
Yeah, according to Israeli media, 2 terrorists were killed during a raid that was an attempt to destroy one of the terrorist homes, one of a person who participated in an earlier attack.
We're getting 2 or maybe 3 possibly?
Maybe 3. Yeah.
On a raid where?
In the West Bank.
In the West Bank, something that, as we mentioned, the IDF operating in the West Bank. There we go. 3 armed Palestinians killed in the West Bank as Israeli army demolishes terrorists' home. Clashes break out in Colombia in the West Bank after IDF move against attacker behind the shooting, the June shooting that left 1 Israeli dead. We're just reminding people that Israel, of course, also under a wave of stabbing attacks, and the IDF operating in the West Bank, as they usually do, carry out raids. So there we have it. Moving on, though, we are still in studio with me now. Joining us as well as Benedetta Berti, a researcher from the INSS. I know you're smiling bashfully. Good morning. Paula Sleer still with me as well. But the Russia Today Middle East bureau chief, but Ami Kaufman is the man of the hour and will give us a deeper look at the stories making headlines around the world, focusing today on the tragic events over the weekend in Paris.
Actually, today we're going to look at some op-eds and analysis about how people are looking at this tragic event in Paris. Here's an op-ed. We're going to start with Nick Cohen from The Guardian. If we could pull that up. Kind of trying to tell people, especially the liberals in Europe, to kind of take an honest look at themselves after this event, this tragic event. Let's take a look at one of the quotes from this op-ed. He says, "To preserve human rights and prevent a wave of authoritarian governments taking power, you have to accept that some security concerns are real, not a plot by an evil group of conspirators to create a moral panic. You must also understand that migration and radical Islamism are changing Europe now, and that if you want a say in the direction of your country is going, you must first earn the right to be heard by facing that change honestly." So a bit of I guess, putting the truth out there in the air, especially for liberals who are kind of saying, you know, Europe has to be a diverse place. We should all open our gates for everybody. And Nick Cohen is saying, well, not so fast, maybe.
Deeply, which is I think, you know, the long version of this is really quite sad in that respect. You know, open borders as opposed to, you know, the barriers that are coming up and will most likely come up.
I'm going to see some more about exactly what you're saying. This is from the Washington Post by Ann Applebaum, "Regaining Control in an Unsettled Europe." She's talking about how to kind of lower the level of tension and panic and what might happen in Europe if you don't. Let's see the money quote from this one. "There is no avoiding it. These terrorist attacks will consolidate this sense of insecurity. The feeling that no one at the national or international level is in charge of policy toward terrorism or refugees, even in those European countries that have no terrorism or refugees at all. And unless the sense of control returns, the political consequences could be severe. Across the continent, a surge in support for far-right, anti-European or anti-immigrant political groups has already begun in Poland, the Netherlands, Sweden, and France itself."
Right.
Very kind of similar words coming from The Economist, which addresses also the fear, the xenophobia, and who will gain from this. Let's take a look at the money quote from here. This is the headline is "What Paris' Night of Horror Means for Europe." "It is understandable fear that among the many refugees flocking to Europe from Syria are some experienced fighters who mean to do harm when the opportunity arises. The attack will also exacerbate the anxiety about an enemy within that is at war with both the West's cultural mores and foreign policies that are perceived as anti-Islam. Anti-radicalization programs that almost every country in Europe with a significant Muslim population has a version of are well-meaning but of dubious effectiveness. Across Europe, there's no shortage of populist politicians who are only too happy to exploit the fallout from what happened last night," meaning on Friday night. Right. And lastly, from Frank Bruni from the New York Times, who was talking about how politicians kind of really immediately delved into this political opportunism and saying, especially in the United States, about how, you know, we should have gun control and stuff like that. Here's his money quote. "On Saturday morning, I read that Paris was going to be good for Republicans. I read that Paris was going to be good for Democrats. I felt sick. For a few hours, even a few days, I'd like to focus on the pain of Parisians and how that magnificent city reclaims any sense of order, any semblance of safety. I'd like to not wonder if Hillary Clinton's odds of election just ticked upward or downward, or if Donald Trump's chest-thumping bluster suddenly became more seductive." We also have the usual cartoonists that have, you know, a really way of just summing it up.
I know where you're heading with this, because that was the first one that that grabbed my eye, and especially the cartoonists, as we're speaking about these attacks taking place nearly less than a year. I think it's less than a year since the Charlie Hebdo shootings in Paris, which were the last terrorist attack to grip that city.
This first one is from Joan Sfar, one of the cartoonists of Charlie Hebdo. Let's see what he says. He says, you can see his little caption there. "Friends from the whole world, thank you for #pray for Paris, but we don't need more religion. Our faith goes to music, kisses, life, champagne, and joy. #Paris is about life."
Very true.
Here's Chris Riddell from The Guardian, and he's showing a defiant Marianne who is cradling her dead.
Right.
Here is Damien, one of the Le Figaro's cartoonists, showing the Eiffel Tower with the bleeding flag. This is Bob from The Telegraph, showing that all behind you, Francois, all of these world leaders that we can see, Obama and David Cameron. This is Carlos Latoufe, a very famous Brazilian cartoonist, showing dead corpses under the French flag. And one from America, the Arizona Republic, saying the Statue of Liberty, kind of saying, "I'm coming, going to save you," for the French people, with the Eiffel Tower there in the background.
I'm coming. My God.
That's slightly scary.
Yeah, that is slightly scary in many
people could take that a very
last thing they need.
Yes, and there's an article. Just reminds me, there's an article I read very late last night at the Daily Beast about. It was actually from a guy, I'm opening this for daily discussion. There's a guy who was one of the guards in the prison in Iraq, where al-Baghdadi, who is the head of ISIS, he was one of the American guards that released him around 2009, or al-Baghdadi, I think, was released around 2009. And that al-Baghdadi basically said goodbye when he left the prison by saying, "I'll see you in New York."
Wow.
Now, I don't know if those are things that are coming out now in the media to scare the mass population about the big bad foe that is ISIS, and they are bad, but it's these tidbits that you're seeing here and there. But yes,
that's all
that
for
would
me.
be it.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to move basically forward on Paris, where we stand. I don't know if we have Jonathan Satchadati with us, but not yet. But just the most recent Islamic State's campaign of international terror. Let's take a look at that. The attacks on French soil followed close on the heels of an attack in Lebanon's capital, Beirut, in which 41 people were killed in a double suicide bombing, and that happened. That also was Friday. It happened Thursday night. Late last month, also the explosion of a Russian passenger jet that we were discussing, carrying 224 people. So ISIS is striking all over, and the streak of attacks comes as the Islamic State is facing a challenge on its, so to speak, home turf in Iraq, where Kurdish militias have managed to liberate the town of Sinjar. And that also happened over the weekend. ISIS has also suffered setbacks in Syria, supposedly. Now, the Mideast losses, which were partially enabled to die to a campaign of airstrikes by the U.S. and its allies, as well as Russia, have not had that much or enough effect on the group's ability to carry out attacks abroad, sadly. As we said, we are joined in studio by INSS researcher and Tel Aviv University lecturer, Dr. Benedetta Berti. Good morning to you. And Paula Sleer still with us. Dr. Berti, I'm looking at you at ISIS. This has been quite 2 months. We're looking the jetliner, and we're looking at Beirut and Iraq. I think that then also things happen daily.
Yes.
What is wrong with how ISIS is being fought right now on the ground in Iraq and Syria? Because it doesn't seem to be working. I mean, Sinjar, tell me if it is as crucial a city to be taken away from ISIS as the press and the media are making it, and what is wrong with the battle against them right now?
It's not. I mean, there's no question that the momentum of expansion has stopped a few months ago, and since then they have had some tactical setbacks. That's no question. And the airstrikes are bearing some fruit. Right. If we look at the men losses, then yes, ISIS is also bleeding in terms of how many people they're losing, how many people are killed or injured, and how many people are going to join the caliphate on a daily basis. It used to be many more last years. Now that number has trickled down. So there are some difficulties that may partially explain this turning to the far enemy and this striking abroad. But let's not overestimate it. They still have solid control. They still have money. They still have resources. They can keep going for a long time.
And Paul, I'm going to take you back to you came back just a few days ago, no, from Syria. The Russians alone, in that area, trying to battle ISIS, can they do it alone?
They'd rather not do it alone.
Obviously.
They'd rather have an international community. Can they do it alone? They can certainly, they believe, make more of an impact than a year and a half of American airstrikes have been making. As I was saying to you earlier, the Russian base comprises 4,500 people. We toured around the base, and it's a very big infrastructure. Planes are taking off literally by the minute. And they have said, although the comment was later retracted, that they see the airstrikes for the next 3 to 4 months. But subsequent to that, the comments were made that they're not going to put any time frame on them. I think the problem, and this was raised in the earlier discussion, and it references what you're saying, I think there really needs to be a look at how better these campaigns can be done. And the question of boots on the ground is what more and more people are talking about. The problem for the Russians is that at the moment, the Russian president has the backing of his population, of the Russians. They support these airstrikes. You don't want to send boots on the ground. You don't want to see casualties on the ground, people coming back in body bags, because then it's going to change the public opinion.
Completely. The question is, can it be done without? Because I mean, right now, other than the Kurdish Peshmerga, there's no real unified force on the ground, boots.
Well, that's
not
part
planes.
of the problem. Yeah. But I would argue that, okay, the airstrikes are given some level of support to, let's say, the Kurdish fighters or some Syria rebels that are fighting both Assad and ISIS. But if we look at the last month of Russian strikes, for example, the main target has not been ISIS. Let's not confuse things. Has been non-jihadist or non-ISIS affiliated rebels, and has been pretty much geared at backing Bashar al-Assad. So let's not try to think that this is the next stage in the anti-ISIS battle.
Right. Except that the Russians would argue that. The Russians would say that they are fighting
they
any
would,
kind of terrorist
propaganda.
infrastructures. But they would argue that it's a propaganda coming from the Western side as well. Either way, strikes are happening inside Syria that...
To prop Assad.
Or to tackle terrorism. It depends which side you look at.
But it's a double agenda in that respect, and we do know that.
So maybe it's a double agenda. So what? There's enough people out there that say even if it's a double agenda, there are terrorist groups in Syria that are being targeted and are being weakened because of the Russian airstrikes.
But then there's the argument that Assad is also prepping up the fact that he's letting the militants.
There is Assad today. There is ISIS today in Syria because of what Assad is doing. More than 80% of civilian casualties are killed by Assad and his forces.
And there's also ISIS today because of Western involvement in the Middle East and not having long-term agendas.
Not mutually exclusive.
I think both arguments can... I mean, this is the problem.
No,
this is how the Russians see it and how the Western see it.
Exactly. No, this is the problem in Vienna right now, and the people around the table, which we also have to mention. In Vienna, where the talks were taking place over the weekend, the only people missing from the table were the Syrians, which at the end of the day...
On purpose.
On purpose.
That is on purpose. First to get an international consensus. I mean, that sounds crazy, but actually it's not. Because this war has become a regional proxy war, and because all the main parties are so strongly supported by third foreign parties, being Iran or being Saudi Arabia or being Russia or being the United States, it makes sense to create an international consensus first and then move towards the Russia. So it's not a completely, it makes sense, although in practice it's not really moving forward.
And again, I would argue the Russian point of view that it doesn't make sense, that if you're talking about Syria, you need to have the Syrians represented. It's their country that's being destroyed. It's their future that you're talking about. So again, the Russians say that Bashar Assad has to be involved in any kind of movement in the country.
Represent all Syrians. That's
no, he doesn't. But he represents a fair amount.
A fair amount?
Well, I mean, I can talk about Latakia, which is an Assad stronghold. And there we were on the streets of Latakia talking to local Syrians, and everybody there believes that he's anyway.
I used to live in Syria, so I know exactly what you mean. It's 10% of the population.
And you have Damascus, which is pro-Assad. You have
Damascus is not pro-Assad.
I recently was in Damascus as well, and we had exactly the same kind of feedback coming from people on the ground.
Let's move back to ISIS, because we won't agree on how Assad is saving Syria.
That's what we love to do with Paula.
Yes.
But that said, I think it goes to show that it's a messy situation when it comes to even the international community.
Absolutely.
Trying to step in and move Syria in some sort of direction. Syria is the core problem of everything that's happening right now in the world. Yeah, but hold on one second, because I want us to go back to Paris, France, because speaking of these coalitions, Jonathan Satchadati, I-24 News European correspondent, standing by. And Jonathan, I want to ask you, because you're British by descent and you have just moved to Paris to help us cover this news, but also in England, the threat level has been raised too severe. We're seeing it across all these places in Europe. Are we heading towards some sort of a coalition that will step up this battle against ISIS? I don't know if you had a chance to listen to what was going on in the studio right now, but at the end of the day, it does feel that without that type of coalition, with boots on the ground, nothing will happen. Is there any type of understanding as such from the European community at this point?
Obviously, the discussions you're having in studio about ISIS and international security are key to what's going on at the moment. And the really important level of this is how it touches people on the ground, both in Britain and here in France. I'm joined right now by one Briton and one French person who are very kind to be with us here on I-24, Ben and Catherine. Catherine is a journalist from Britain working and living here in France with her husband, Ben, who is a music promoter who worked very often with people at the Bataclan and knows people who were caught up in the attack on Friday. So could I start by asking you first how it feels as Parisians, as people living here, this horrible attack on Friday, on the Bataclan and the other attacks at the same time. How does it feel living in this city at this very moment?
Well, it feels weird. It feels that the capital of lights has been attacked. You feel shame, you feel sad, and you just want to pay tribute to the victim and thinking, just feeling like you are for a couple hours in a war zone. So it's just that's the way you feel, and you're just thinking of people who are actually in a war zone. So that's pretty weird.
And Catherine, as a mother of young children here, do you worry about the safety and security for ordinary people?
As a mother, you worry anyway, pretty much every second of every day. So it's just compounded. And I think that as parents, we feel like we're asking ourselves some very serious questions about, we love this city, but I don't want to worry about my children every time they go out the house. That when they grow up and they become teenagers, I don't want to feel that that panic every time they leave. I want them to grow up in security. It's all anyone wants for their children. And I mean, it's hard to. Lots of people in lots of countries don't have that for their children, and now it feels even here in France, where we should feel safe, we don't at the moment.
Yeah.
And obviously, these particular attacks were aimed quite largely at younger people in some ways, in bars, in a football match, also in the music venue. Ben, you know the venue very well, having worked with them as a promoter and an agent. Can you tell us a bit about the actual venue itself? We heard stories from statuses of people inside who are on the first level, the lower level. Can you describe a bit for us what the actual Bataclan is like?
Okay, the Bataclan, I think for one reason they choose this place is because the Bataclan you can enter directly into it. From the entrance to the venue itself, it just goes direct. So I think c'est fini. Yeah. I think it's actually you get into it, yeah, and then you have a balcony just up there. So it's about 1,000 people you can put on the ground, yeah, and there's a balcony all around, okay. And what the shape is, that's quite weird because you just get in, then you have the bar on the left, in front of the venue, and then you have like some kind of on the same level, some kind. It's not a small balcony, but it's just upper than the place where the people are standing, and then you have the stage. So it's a direct thing.
Kind of caught in this one space together.
Yeah, it's all things. So when you get in, you don't see the balcony because the balcony is just on your back, and actually you have the roof up there. So you go in, and then you have a very high ceiling. So probably that's the shape they were looking for. And luckily, I think there's a lot of exit on the other side, which we saw on the TV. So actually this exit, I think, saved a lot of life, probably. I don't know, yeah.
I hope so. And listen, thank you so much for joining us here on I-24. Really appreciate it. Wish you all the best. And as Paris begins to return to normal, let's hope that people begin to have some normality in their lives. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. And back to you in the studio now.
Thank you, Jonathan Satchadati, I-24 News European contributor, with us for us in Paris. Ali Wakad, I-24 News senior Middle East analyst, joining us in studio. I'm still here with Benedetta Berti of the NSS and Paula Sleer, Russia Today's Middle Eastern bureau chief. I want us to look at the following report. This is the profile of the so-called terrorist, one of the terrorists perpetrating the attack in Paris. Speaking of ISIS and the profile of these young men and how to stop them, let's take a look at what we know right now about one of the terrorists.
These are the first images recorded from the entrance of the Bataclan. On the floor, corpses everywhere. Not far, people nervously crying and screaming. They just escaped this mass killing and realized the horror. A bit farther down the street, the policemen are trying to get closer to the auditorium. The assault against the hostage takers hasn't yet started. Inside, one of the three kamikazes is French. His name, Omar Ismail Mustafai. Born in Essené in the Persian neighborhood, Mustafai was a delinquent before he became a terrorist, and the police had a file on him since 2010. The man used to live in Chartres, 100 kilometers southwest of Paris. He used to pray and try to preach the jihadist ideology in this little mosque in the neighboring city of Luz. Those who knew him tried to minimize his influence.
This individual, we haven't seen him since coming into this mosque, since taking over the leadership of this mosque. We practically haven't seen him here since 2013.
Omar Ismail Mustafai last went to Syria this past year. His parents live in this little house in Romey-sur-Seine, in the Champagne region. On Sunday morning, the police perquisitioned their house and arrested 6 of the terrorists' relatives. Mustafai's neighbors were shocked and surprised.
Me, I have been living here for a year and a half. When I arrived, they were already living here, so I think you know that this is a little couple of retired people without any problem and living their conventional life.
Mustafa had been convicted 8 times for common criminal offenses between 2004 and 2010. Unfortunately, his criminal record didn't prevent him from calmly preparing and perpetrating his murderous raid across the French capital.
Back to ISIS and you know, the battle to fight them. Ali Waqid, we're looking, I mean, homegrown, whether they came in, the reach of ISIS to people in Europe and to recruit them is not ceasing. That seems to be just, you know, getting better. Am I right in saying that?
I think that, of course, the Islamic State is developing a real machine that is facilitating the recruitment of these people. Yael, we are talking about all the 7 apparently were in a way or another known to the French authorities and to the Belgian authorities, beside the Syrian guy, if it is a real Syrian guy, right, for activities in the world of crime. And this is the database that the French are now concentrating in order to try to find the connection between those who recruit and the recruitees, the candidates. And in my opinion, the French know very well that in the mosques of Paris, those young who are not integrated, and not only in Paris, in general in Europe, the youngsters that were not integrated in the societies are easy victims for the Islamic State recruiters. And we should see how the propaganda machine of the Islamic State work. And when from time to time we try to go to the biographies of people who in Raqqa or in Mosul were taped and videoed by the Islamic State to call their brothers in France and in Belgium to join these kinds of activities, there is almost all the time these are people who were known to the authorities for being part of the delinquency life in Europe. So we have here the beginning of a line that could lead us to these kind of networks. But in my opinion, the most complicated mission is to reach the recruiters. The recruiters are those who have the charisma, are those who can influence the people, and are those who can be a kind of a model for those youngsters with no hope and with no life. And I think that there is now a campaign in France against the mosques, and I don't think that like one of the former French ministers said, we should close the mosque. But yes, you should know where the money come and who is leading these mosques, and you should not close the eyes to on the fact that some money is legal money coming from Saudi Arabia and encouraging these kinds of activities in the mosques of Europe. But Saudi Arabia is an ally of France. The French want to send their mirage to the Saudi Arabia, and there is no clear policy vis-a-vis those people.
And speaking, listen, we know this is a proxy war. We know it's a proxy war that, you know, the Gulf states are facilitating. We're talking about Syria, facilitating versus Iran. I'm asking, that money is a perfect point. The money. Okay, you know what? I'm going to put you on the spot, Dr. Berkeley. The money, because you mentioned very rightfully so that they are well organized. They have the finances, ISIS. In that respect, forget boots on the ground for a second. Why can't the intelligence community not get to that, not get to the core of the problem?
Well, good question. Difficult answer, but very simply, if you think about a group like Al-Qaeda, most of it's moving of money cross international financial borders. So that could be tracked down and frozen, for example. ISIS makes most of its money locally.
In Syria. In Syria, in Iraq,
Exactly. How does he make it? Well, first of all, it's still worth about $2 billion, but how does he make it? He sells oil, he sells antique artifacts that he loots, and we all get shocked by when ISIS blows up a building, but then everything else they do sell for profit. They have extortion, they have taxation, they have an entire system in place that is much harder to be frozen from abroad.
Right.
So that makes it more difficult, more complicated. Things that can be done are, of course, cracking down of the black market sale of oil, and that's something that affects Turkey, where a lot of this oil is smuggled and sold, but also Syria. The Bashar al-Assad regime buys oil from ISIS because it needs it. It's a war economy, so everybody's buying from everybody.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody buys from everybody. How can that be stopped? And in that respect, I'm asking you, maybe it is boots on the ground. Maybe that's what's needed.
You know, Bashar Assad is buying the oil, and Bashar Assad is considered to be part of the enemies. But when Turkey, a member of NATO, a member of this coalition, the anti-Islamic State, and buy the oil, and I'm not sure that the oil that the Turkish are buying cannot be intercepted. The track of oil, that brings money. Okay, you sold the oil, the Islamic State sold the oil. When you are paid by the Turkish, whether they are private businessmen or firms, or whether this is the Turkish government, I think that the security services, the intelligence services in the West should know this and should point this. And you see, we are not seeing any clear strategy vis-a-vis the Islamic State, because when the Jordanians were angry about their pilot getting killed, they bombarded Raqqa. When the French were upset because of Paris attack, they bombarded Raqqa. Right. We know where the head of the Islamic State are. We know what our main compounds of the Islamic State are. We know how they make their money. We know where their establishments are. The question is whether there is a will in the international community to eradicate the Islamic State. For more than 1 year, there was a campaign led by the international community against the Islamic State. In this whole 1 year, the Islamic State did not cease to progress and to occupy more and more territory, which we are not seeing, by the way, in the last 2 months, when a serious combined operation started on the air and on the ground by the Russian, Hezbollah, and the Iranian in Syria. Here, the Syrians are on daily basis gaining territory, on daily basis, which we did not see during 12 months of a so-called war against the Islamic State led by the United States.
In ways. But Benedetta Berti.
We don't have time. I know we don't have
time.
You're giving me the look. You don't have time.
I know, but I'm very sad because I think there's a lot more input than that. Exactly.
My point is that actually ISIS is moving westwards. The one being weakened are not ISIS, but that's a different conversation.
And we do not know, and I think that's part of the problem. Do stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. It is still Monday, November 16th, 2015. This is still the morning edition on I-24 News, and thank you for staying with us. The discovery of a Syrian passport on the body of one of the perpetrators of the attack on the Stade de France confirmed one of Europe's worst fears about the massive influx of asylum seekers crossing into its borders, fleeing wars in the Middle East. Reports in Greek and Serbian media said the passport belonged to a man called Ahmed al-Muhammad, who, along with another family member, was registered as an asylum seeker in Greece after being rescued from a drowning migrant ship. Now, the news was all over. Many, including politicians, needed to sound alarms that the migrants pose not only a socio-economic risk, but a concrete security one as well, and urge an immediate change in policy. I'm joined in studio by Ami Kaufman, of course, my I-24 News contributor, professor of international relations also at Tel Aviv University, Dr. Emmanuel Navon. Good morning to you. Now, before we do anything else, I want us to turn live now, actually, on the phone to Lars Fabok Andersen, the EU representative to Israel, the EU ambassador to Israel. Ambassador Andersen, I want to ask you this, Monday, these attacks were terrible in Paris. We're looking, though, now at Europe, which will probably stricken down its security measures, which will spell quite a detrimental future, I think, for the refugees at its borders. Are there calls in Europe to lock borders more? What can be done in this respect if indeed, through these mass amount of very needed, very desperate refugees, also elements of terrorism are coming in or using that to come in?
Well, yes, obviously there is, but I think it's well to remember what the President of the European Commission just said last night, what Mr. Juncker said, which was that despicable as this terror incident has been, it should not give way to base reactions like, for example, stamping all refugees as terrorists. Obviously, a lot of those people who are coming in, the overwhelming majority of them, are legitimate asylum seekers, and there's no reason to bar their entry, and therefore the efforts will now have to be focused on ensuring that terrorists amongst them are isolated and apprehended before they get into Europe. But it's a very complex question, as you know. There's also a big issue on returning fighters and so on and so forth, which all point to the fact that we'll need to strengthen our internal European cooperation between law enforcement agencies, between police, and so on and so forth, in order to be able to apprehend these people before they commit atrocious acts like the ones we saw in Paris.
Ambassador Anderson, I think, a very valid point. And speaking of that cooperation, because all the calls on the beginning of this week, after this really terrible weekend in Paris, are for greater cooperation, greater international cooperation. When it comes to Europe, do you think we're looking at any type of greater cooperation in terms of attacking or trying to solve the problem of ISIS in its root core, which is the Middle East?
I think that we are going to see a strengthening of the struggle and the combat against the terror organization, Daesh or ISIS. And I also think that we are going to see a stepped-up diplomatic effort to try to settle the conflict in Syria. As you know, there have already been a number of meetings going on in Vienna to that effect. And thirdly, I think one is going to see a strengthened cooperation within Europe along the lines of what already was outlined by heads of state and government back in February of this year after the latest wave of attack, or last wave of attacks in Paris, on strengthening our anti-terror cooperation in Europe and beyond, because it's very important to point out that we want to increase our cooperation particularly with the countries across the south in the Mediterranean, including Israel, in stopping the wave of terror from spreading further.
But as you mentioned, terror and raises also a lot of fears and animosities within people. Is there a concern also that what we're looking at that is happening in Europe right now is going to put rise also to a lot of right-wing ideologies, or do you think that we're going to look at a turn to the right from Europe?
Well, I think it's too early to speculate about that, but obviously this will be used by certain forces to advocate against further migration to Europe and maybe also for cracking down on some of the civil and political rights that people are enjoying in Europe, and which is the hallmark of the European Union and the democracy that we enjoy.
That we would like to see maintained in many ways. Ambassador Anderson, I want to thank you very much for being with us this morning. And to the point of what we just discussed with the ambassador to the EU in Israel, the refugees are going to be one of the major issues discussed in the G20 summit today, but also one of the main issues and the sticky points when it comes to Europe and what it is facing in the wave of terror. Let's take a look at the following report of where the refugee situation stands this morning on this Monday, post this weekend in Europe, and break it down from there.
Calais, northern France. Just hours after the series of brutal attacks on Paris, fire broke out at the refugee camp near the town, sparking suspicion that it might be related to the terrorism in the French capital. The refugee camp houses some 6,000 migrants. For those living in the immediate surroundings, opposition to the influx of migrants into France is now something they are candid about.
I organized a loan so that I could leave. We can't do this anymore, we just can't. We can't live here anymore, it's just not possible. Before it was so peaceful and I was happy. This is a nice detached house. I'm having to leave this house because of what's outside of it.
This growing frustration may be fueling a wider political shift in France, where the anti-immigration far right is gaining momentum. The ongoing investigation into the Paris attacks, which has raised the possibility that some of the terrorists may have come from Syria, has ignited fury over the country's migration policies. The National Front, led by Marine Le Pen, has been actively campaigning. Support for the National Front is growing.
Immigration. We must focus on immigration. We're being invaded now, and it's way too much. There are a lot of poor people, and we keep letting more foreigners in. They will receive the inclusion income support. They are given everything.
But how many migrants from Syria has France actually let in? According to the United Nations, it's one of the least accepting countries, with only about 20,000 Syrians admitted over the last several years. Nevertheless, migrants with certain passports are allowed to travel through EU countries and back and forth from the Middle East to France, potentially putting the country at risk. The European Union estimates that some 6,000 people from Europe have joined the IS, and according to US officials, 185 IS members in France have returned to the country after fighting in Iraq and Syria. Since the attacks on Charlie Hebdo in January, French authorities have raised security at airports, launched investigations into possible IS cells in the country, and implemented a surveillance system for monitoring possible extremists. While the focus after the Charlie Hebdo attacks was maintaining a balance between these measures and free speech, much of the debate is now focused on migrants. Their flow has not been stemmed over the past year, forcing authorities to come up with new policies to tackle the crisis.
With us in studio also Dr. Emmanuel Navonen. I want to ask you about Europe because I think that's the question of the hour in this respect. The refugee crisis, right? The refugee crisis not going away. How should Europe deal with it in respect of what has just happened over the weekend?
Well, first of all, they've been taken by surprise when these refugees arrived from Syria, as we know. Turkey...
Which is also surprising that they were taken by surprise, but that's just me. Yes.
Well, the civil war in Syria has been going on for 2 years, and they look the other way.
Exactly.
As opposed to what they did in Libya, by the way, where they had interest with the oil from Gaddafi.
And
but
that's okay to bomb and move
exactly.
Yeah.
For humanitarian reasons.
Exactly.
But then, of course, what happened also is that the president of Turkey let all these refugees or migrants move to Europe. And the truth of the matter is that it worked for him because about a month ago, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel flew to Ankara asking him to stop the flood of immigrants. So obviously now he has this leverage over Europe when for the past 2 decades, basically Turkey has been begging the EU to join this club, and now the European leaders are begging him to stop the migration. And by the way, the G20 summit is being hosted by him. So now he put himself in this position of force thanks to his very ambiguous policy towards the refugees and the immigrants.
Towards the refugees and the immigrants who are still, who will keep also flowing into Europe, that we know. I mean, because as you mentioned, the Syrian war, which at this point has been going on for 4.5 years, is not stopping. One of the main points in Europe that has been accepting the refugees, has opened its doors, as Dr. Navon mentioned, is Germany. And in Germany, whether or not those borders will be closed, it's interesting to see what people feel in this point in time. Let's go straight to Germany, where we're joined by I24 News correspondent Polina Garaev. Polina, good morning to you.
Good morning.
And I mean, it's interesting to me to try and figure out this morning or post this weekend after these attacks, Germany being truly the only place in Europe that has been forthcoming towards refugees as much as it could. Are there any calls towards Angela Merkel to close borders? Are there calls to try and stop this welcoming policy that she's trying to institute? Are we seeing voices from the right being heard over the course of the weekend?
Of course, this event, and particularly the fact that one of the perpetrators carried a Syrian passport and went through the Balkan route, is planning.
Which we don't know for sure yet, I have to say. I think that has not been completely confirmed. But yes, it's out there in the news. Yes.
Even the suspicion is enough to play into the hands of right-wing activists, Pegida activists here, who already mentioned that reports that show that the reality that they have been warning against a year ago is now coming true. All of those reports are seen as gold, as one activist I spoke to told me. But among the general population, there's also a feeling that if we turn our backs to the refugees that are escaping this very terrorism that we've seen in Paris, the terrorists might as well has won. So we're seeing both reactions. On the one hand, fear and, of course, concern. Also, when it comes to Germany's own security situation, they're wondering if such a thing could happen here too. But on the other hand, they do not want to cease this welcoming policy and open door policy. On the political level, of course, we're seeing also diverse reactions. We have the conservative politicians, especially coming from Bavaria, that have been very vocal critics of Merkel's policy and lately have been more appeased with this policy, now are again raising the voice, calling for tighter border controls and security measures. And we have seen some tightening in that regard and discussions of possible attempts to expand the already existing border controls.
The existing border controls, but I think the concern, and thank you, Paulina, for that one, I think the concern really will be the dealings with the refugees in Europe at this point. Joining us in studio also Ruthie Sinai, I24 News editor. Good morning to you. Thank you for rushing in.
Sure.
In that respect, when we're looking at, the refugees, if indeed true that one of the perpetrators came in with a mass of refugees coming in, first of all, can that even be stopped is one thing that I'm asking. And what do you think that we're looking at when it comes to the refugee issue at this point?
I think that it can't be stopped. There's going to be the odd rotten apple in the barrel. That's where good intelligence comes in. I think by and large, we have to be very...
We're expecting many more, though, throughout the year.
I understand. So there'll be 2 and 3 and 5 rotten apples. I don't think it's going to be like a massive invasion of Daesh, operatives coming into Europe and taking advantage of these people who are genuinely fleeing, whether for economic or reasons, or whether they're afraid for their lives and are sick
themselves.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. No, I mean.
So I don't think. I think we need to be careful, about throwing out the bath with the bathwater. Look, I think. Yeah, the way. No, I want to phrase this carefully. I think the way I do understand these sentiments being evoked and provoked by these massacres in Paris, but the common values that everybody talks about, that the G20 and everybody is standing up and talking about, the need for solidarity and to stand up to terror and so on. These common values, they're not just words. I mean, if Europe starts kicking out or blocking off or preventing asylum seekers from coming in, genuine asylum seekers, what happens to all these values everybody talks about?
Fraternité, liberté.
Yes, yes. We can be cynical about it because we're, journalists are cynical, but in fact, this is a sane, I think, reasoned reason to be careful what we do and to prevent some sort of, gung-ho, wholesale...
which, at this point has not happened yet, but I'm thinking of the Hungarian borders and I'm thinking of the Croatian one, I'm thinking of the mass...
That's it.
Exactly,
I'm
looking at those fences and looking at that. Is there something that Europe can do, Dr. Navon, in your mind?
Well, there are more and more politicians in France, for example, who already, after the first wave of refugees to Europe, were calling for ground operations against the Islamic State in Syria and in Iraq in order to stop the source of this mass immigration. And I think that now, after those terrific attacks, horrible attacks in Paris, more and more voices in France are calling for ground operation.
Ground operation in Syria.
In Syria, not only airstrikes, but also a ground operation, because the source of this immigration, the source of this wave of refugees is there. And therefore, more and more people are talking about the need to not only have military strikes, but also have boots on the ground.
And the terrifying notion to me on that is, which I think you're right, by the way. I personally, at this point, I'm leaning towards how can ISIS be stopped if the battle against them on the ground in Syria is not well organized by a well-organized army. But that said, we know what happens when that goes on, don't we, Ruthie?
Well,
when foreign militaries go into the Middle East.
It's a danger, of course.
I think we're seeing the results of that in some ways.
Exactly. There really is very little doubt that the American intervention in 2003 in Iraq was one of the root causes for the emergence of Islamic State.
ISIS, at the end of the day, are former Saddam Hussein fighters who were very upset that they got no role in Iraq after the U.S. invasion, and at several years later banded together, and that's what we're looking at.
Okay, but I do think also, we have to keep things in proportion. It's true they've taken over an area, they say the size of the UK, with 8 million residents. But by and large, Islamic State is not a huge organization. Yes, they do have some spoils of war, tanks and stuff. They
have a lot of money, so it seems.
Well, they have money. If one were to bomb their oil wells, they'd have less money. And the sources of their funding can be cut off. It's not a mission impossible. possible. I think there needs to be obviously a concerted Western effort, which again, these values that I talked about before are essential to glue this coalition together. Yes, I think I agree with Emmanuel Navon that it has to be stopped at its root. But having said that, there may well be already sleeper cells and not so sleepy cells in Europe ready to strike. And
so it seems. I think it's important to mention that we did on Friday see before this attack. There was a report, we actually covered it, of mass arrests in Europe. 16 were arrested, I think, on Friday. 17, or 17 were arrested. The work is being done, but it seems almost unstoppable, that you stop it here and then, and it rises up in that respect. Finally, Dr. Navon, I'm just asking you before we move ahead. When it comes to Europe, though, and sending boots on the ground, which you think that the people of Europe might be asking for, the French supposedly might be asking for. That said, animosities after that, people will be coming back, I'm sorry to say, but in that respect, that's the ability to, or the understanding that you're going to lose soldiers also, that you're going to lose the people of France as well.
Well, that's what real life is about. You have to make choices, and I know that the main problem today in France is that people, do not want to send their kids on the ground to fight, but eventually they'll have to do it. And the question is also, will the French have the spine to go it alone, or will they ask the Americans to come with them? And I doubt very much that President Obama, when he's in his last year of his presidency, will send boots on the ground when he was elected in the first place to pull American forces from there. So the
question, he did, which we saw what happened to Iraq after boots were pulled out of Iraq. Sadly, in 2011 they pull out, and we're looking at the aftermath of that at this point.
Maybe the British.
By the way, I just want to add that why were a lot of politicians, and we here also are framing this discussion about how this is going to affect the migrant crisis. We only have reports about one Syrian passport that might have been found on one person. We also have reports that some of these people, the attackers, the assailants, are people that spent many years in France. Some of them actually grew up in France. So it's not only about the recent migrant crisis. This is about how people are included in European society, people that have grown up in France and in Belgium and in other countries, and feel like second-class citizens and are not included.
It's a question of integration, absorption.
That would cause as well. That's actually a fascinating point to also pose to you, Dr. Navon, putting you on the spot because of your French accent. But that said, when it comes to the integration, because a very, very valid point, and thank you for that. When it comes to the integration of these young Muslim, not just in these recent years, these are people who feel really alienated from the society. They say that most of them live in neighborhoods that feel like ghettos in many ways. The core problem, not just in the Middle East, but also the infrastructure and as Ruthie said, the integration.
Except don't forget that you cannot always blame the French government or the Belgian government or the Swedish government, because they're also being incited by an education that is funded by Saudi Arabia. So yes, the governments could be doing more to integrate them, but don't forget that a lot of these kids are being brainwashed with an education that makes them more extremist also. So it comes from both sides. You can always blame the governments themselves as if it was only because of a lack of infrastructure or education or investment. It also comes from a brainwashing in the mosque, in some schools, with a lot of money coming from the Middle East. So it also comes from there.
Yeah. And then, just to add to that point, I think you're absolutely right, because if these kids, with their poor integration, they're petty criminals, a lot of them. They went towards crime, as it is. They're
going to go towards terror.
Right. This radicalization is, kind of overlaps on this.
No, on this thing, but it's it's a joining of a lot of aspects, a lot of elements, which make me think, sadly, of why children feel the need to come out and attack other people. But that's a different discussion. I want to thank you all. We're going to move along now to a different issue. But Ami Kaufman is with us here because the web itself has been, wow, the web has been quite in a
quite
fury.
Active, yeah. I think one of the most amazing things that we've seen through this attack is how specifically social media has been used during the events as they were unfolding, particularly Facebook, particularly Twitter. We have a report about it. Let's take a look.
Let's take a look.
Social media played a crucial role in Friday's coordinated attacks in Paris. While the terrorists were still slaughtering people inside the Bataclan concert hall, a Facebook post by Benjamin Cazeneuve, who was inside, went viral.
I'm still in the Bataclan, first floor, badly wounded. They should break in as soon as possible. There are still survivors inside. They are killing everybody, one after the other. First floor, quickly.
Some say his and similar posts convinced French police to launch an assault on the theater and not wait to negotiate with the perpetrators. While the carnage was ongoing, Facebook activated its so-called safety check feature, previously reserved uniquely for natural disasters. Users in Paris were located by GPS and received a message asking them if they are okay, providing instant relief for friends and family members. In the 24 hours following the attack, 41 million people used the application. During the attack, it was unsafe to be on the streets, and Parisians were ordered to stay in their homes. For those stranded outside, the Twitter hashtag Porte Ouverte or Open Door helped people, in particular tourists, find a place to stay during the chaos. With some 80 people hospitalized in critical condition, some of them from abroad, social media turned into a human mapping device. Under the hashtag Recherche Paris or Searching Paris, concerned family members were helped finding their loved ones. After the dust settled, people around the globe used Instagram, Twitter and Facebook to express sympathy and solidarity, a comforting and fitting response to the cynical and deadly use of social media by the Islamic State.
Ami Kaufman, yes, the web of
amazing
flurry.
stuff. Now, this report actually mentioned that Facebook used its safety check for the Paris attack. There was actually an interesting kind of outrage, I guess, on social media because the safety check was not used one day earlier in the double suicide bombing in Beirut. And a lot of Lebanese, and not only Lebanese, of course, a lot of people, I guess, across social media were posting, hey, why did they not use the safety check for people in Beirut? And they only used it for Paris.
I raise it even further. So, why don't they use it in Iraq? I mean, because in Iraq, for example, stuff, I'm using the light lingo of that, stuff blows up, like that, almost daily. Nobody puts a status, Baghdad. My heart's with Baghdad. I love Baghdad. That does not come up.
Doesn't come up. Well, Facebook responded.
Okay.
And the vice president of growth, a man named Alex Schultz, he kind of outlined how.
Growth.
Well, they obviously.
Ruthie and I are just impressed.
He's obviously doing. He's doing a good job, I think, because Facebook is growing. He said that Paris was the first time that the feature had been implemented for an event that wasn't a natural disaster. As you remember, it's been used in the earthquakes, like in Nepal. So he said there has to be a first time for trying something new, even in complex and sensitive times. And for us, that was Paris. So Paris was the first time that it was used for a non-natural disaster.
My argument to that would be that Beirut was also an unnatural disaster come on Friday morning.
You could say that as well. You could definitely say that. He also said during an ongoing crisis like war or epidemic, safety check in its current form is not that useful for people because there isn't a clear start or end period.
I mean, that
you understand? You don't really say when the war is ended. Nobody really defines when the war is ended and when you can say that this person.
It clearly can't work for. I mean, although it should be a feature, I think that should be on constantly in Syria.
Yeah.
Right.
In some places.
Definitely.
In some places, just should be on in Syria all the time.
Well, hopefully now that after this, now that they check that it works,
maybe
it can happen and they'll be using it.
But,
over 4 million people used the safety check to tell their friends that they were okay in this recent event in Paris. After the massacre, the tricolor colors came out pretty much in full force just about everywhere. A lot of people, a lot of main monuments put these colors and lights. We have a few pictures that we can show. This is, of course, in Rio de Janeiro, the Christ statue. This is
London Bridge.
London Bridge in London. Tower Bridge in London, excuse me.
Sorry, Tower Bridge.
This is here. This is Israel. This is the Tel Aviv municipality when there was a kind of an event there. A few thousand people came for solidarity. There was the London Eye. Yeah, go ahead.
No, there was also the old city of Jerusalem, the walls.
I think we have a picture of that as well coming up.
Do we have the old city of Jerusalem? That was,
This is the Brandenburg. That's a very nice one. Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. This is Shanghai.
Wow.
Look at that.
Wow.
Tower in Shanghai.
Yeah.
And of course, the Sydney Opera. What a beautiful building that is.
Yeah, I think the pyramids were also lit at the.
We might have those coming out. That's of course a very monument. The One World Trade Center, where of course very.
No, this is.
There were attacks there in 2001.
Exactly. So. And now that. The pyramids.
Here are the pyramids looking lit up. Of course, they put the flags of Beirut and Russia because of the plane that was downed by ISIS as well. So all three of these countries have recently suffered some very.
And this is the old
city. Here's the old city. the old walls will be also in Jerusalem.
Also in Jerusalem. But yeah, no, it's, I mean, that unification and pouring of solidarity is wonderful, but as we, I think, sat and discussed over the course of the last hour, one would want to see it in a coalition also to unite together and try and stop this type of violence.
Very true.
Do stay with us. We'll be right back in a couple of minutes, and Ami and everybody's going to still be here. I-24 News Morning Special Editions on this November 16th after a very bloody, heinous weekend in France, where terror attacks were perpetrated by ISIS. From the political reactions, of course, that came across and around the world. With us, joining us in studio also is Tal Shalev, I-24 News diplomatic correspondent. Tal, good morning to you. Good morning. From the second this happened, a world flurry of reactions, statements, whatnot, the bulk of it.
Well, we should probably distinguish between the reactions in the world, and then we can talk a little about the reactions in Israel. World reactions, of course, we hear condemnations all across the globe from countries, from the United States to the UK to Germany, everyone expressing solidarity, everyone expressing their condolences. And let's take a look at the following report to see exactly this sums it up.
As the shock from the unprecedented terror attacks in Paris slowly subsides, the focus is slowly shifting to the intelligence breakdown and policies that enabled such a massacre to happen. And the debate is already taking the form of a political battle. In France, President Hollande's rivals, especially on the right, have an eye to December's regional elections.
Islamic fundamentalism must be destroyed. France must forbid Islamic organizations. They must close radical mosques and expel foreigners who preach hate to our soil, as well as illegal immigrants who shouldn't be here.
Europe has to pull itself together and set the conditions for new immigration policies. Regarding internal security, I expressed a number of propositions to President Hollande. I will make a proposition to the French people, but I think we have to draw the consequences.
The political ramifications of the attacks extend beyond France's borders. The discourse has also reached American shores. In the Democratic presidential debate last night, Hillary Clinton was slammed by her opponents due to what they perceive as unsuccessful interventions in the Middle East during her tenure as Secretary of State.
I don't think any sensible person would disagree that the invasion of Iraq led to the massive level of instability we are seeing right now. I think that was one of the worst foreign policy blunders in the modern history of the United States.
I have said the invasion of Iraq was a mistake, but I think if we're ever going to really tackle the problems posed by jihadi extreme terrorism, we need to understand it and realize that it has antecedents to what happened in Iraq, and we have to continue to be vigilant about it.
The Democratic Party as a whole, especially President Obama, who only recently said that IS has been contained, were blasted by Republicans, including the party's leading candidate in the current race.
Our president wants to take in 250,000 from Syria. It's just insane. We have to be insane. If they had guns, if our people had guns, if they were allowed to carry, it would have been a much, much different situation.
In Israel, security has long been the central electoral issue and continues to shape the political discourse within the country, as well as the government's diplomacy.
In Israel, like in France, terrorism is terrorism. It's time for the world to wake up and unite to defeat terror. It's time that countries condemn terror against us in the same way that they condemn terror anywhere else in the world.
There is a fine, if not altogether blurry, line between leadership and the manipulation of tragedy for political gain. We are witnessing many politicians attempt to walk it without crossing over.
Tal Shalev, I-24 News diplomatic correspondent with us in studio. We saw the flurry of reactions from around the world. To me, before I ask you the question, it really was, I think uncanny that the American president sits on an exclusive interview on Friday morning on one of the networks and says that ISIS has been contained, and several hours later that happens. But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also came out, I think it was yesterday evening, right?
Well, Netanyahu, the event happened during the Jewish Sabbath, so it took a while till he gave an on-camera statement. He was quick to condone the events and also to extend assistance to the French authorities. And Israel actually has been transferring intel to the French security services to try and help the services to try and help them solve this. Right. But at the end of the day, Israel has a few stakes here, a few levels of stakes in this event. First and foremost, there's a very large French expatriate community in Israel and a very significant Jewish community in France. So this makes this place much more close to home than if it would be happening in any other place. And we saw all Israeli politicians, including Netanyahu, speak out in French, in their own language, and express condolences in French. This is a sign of respect and expression of solidarity. But there are two other levels, of course. The first one is that Israel is a leading expert, unfortunately, in the war against terror. And Netanyahu himself considers himself the #1 know-how, probably, amongst world leaders on this topic. But it is true that Israel has both the intel and the technology that can assist many countries in their war against terror. And it also has experience in that delicate balance between freedom
of liberties,
freedom
well,
of liberties
social liberties,
and security needs. But and
or
so,
does it? But that's just me.
And Israel has been taking a backstage, but a very significant role backstage in these whole attempts to counter ISIS. It has been transferring intel. Just a few weeks ago, Israel did give some of the hints, some of the clues that led to the conclusion that the Russian plane was bombed in Sinai. So Israel is involved in all of this. But of course, this is Europe, and Israel has a very tense relationship with Europe. And there is, you hear this more from right-wing politicians, but you heard it also a bit more subtly from the Israeli Prime Minister. There's an expectation in Israel that Europeans will understand Israel now more, that Europeans will now maybe try to compare and understand how terror in Israel feels and terror in the West Bank feels while they are undergoing these traumatic events in Paris. But if we look back in history, after 9/11, there was a huge cooperation between the United States and Israel exactly on this. There was an expanded understanding on how the battle against terror needs to be fighted. But Europe is a totally different story. And the comparisons between the situation in Israel and the situation in France doesn't go over the Mediterranean. They do not get it that way. It doesn't work. So this is a risky situation. But nevertheless, Netanyahu is very keen on keeping himself at the forefront of this discussion and this discourse to make clear that he is one of the leaders, and he likes saying, "I told you so." And if anyone can say it, probably it may be him.
Most likely. But, for so many compounded and different, reasons in Europe itself. At the end of the day, though, Tal, you're leading me to what is the problem behind everything that's happening right now. And I'm not going to blame one specific religion or another, rather the religion. This is a battle that we're seeing over religion over the course of the last several years within the Middle East. And Friday's attacks in Paris were carried out by Muslims. They do not represent the religion or its followers. It's important to state that. It was the message community leaders are trying to desperately, over the weekend, convey in the days following the attack. Though Muslim religious leaders promptly denounced the massacre and politicians clearly blamed the radical Islamic State movement, who took responsibility for the violence, average Muslims fear they will become the innocent victims of collateral damage from a conflict rooted in the Middle East. And France's 5 million Muslims face a backlash after attacks in January, in the Charlie Hebdo attacks and in the kosher market that killed 17 people at the satirical magazine and also at a kosher supermarket. Another community that is living in trepidation of future attacks is, of course, the Jewish one. Jewish institutions were not targeted in this last Friday weekend attacks, but they're also feeling vulnerable, as I think everybody in Europe is feeling this morning. We're joined in studio by Pierre Besagnon. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
I hope I pronounced your last name right.
Perfect.
Perfecto. Okay. And you're the former head of the French Jewish community. Good morning to you. I want to ask you, we're going to be joined shortly on the phone by the president of the Grand Synagogue. We're also going to be joined from London by Sheikh Osama Hassan, a senior researcher of the Islamic Society at the Quilliam Research Center in the United Kingdom. Good morning to you, Dr. Hassan.
Good morning.
I want to start first with the studio, but I want you to listen to all that we have to say. And I'm asking you, Pierre, at the beginning of all of this. I don't want to pinpoint the Jewish community in these attacks, because it was young, vibrant, alive people that were targeted in Paris over the course of the weekend. When it comes to what's going on in Paris, what is your feeling? What do you think is happening to minorities, to people of different faiths, and all this hate that we're seeing?
Yesterday, President Hollande made a speech and said that it's a war. And I think this war starts not with the past days, terrorist attack, not with Charlie Hebdo. For us, Jews in France, start with Toulouse. Right. When Mohamed Merah came to the school, killed 4 persons, 3 kids and 1 man, and few days before killed soldiers, French soldiers, we had to consider that this is a war managed with totally different than the previous war. And if we can consider today the Third World War, it's with no borders, no countries, just ideology. I will not be provocative, but when years ago we were talking about clash of civilization, about ideologies, we have to consider we are not in war against Islam. That's not at all. And we know how the large majority of the Muslims all over the world are affected by what's happened in terms of terrorism. But as you mentioned, we have a radical Islamist who has decided to make a war against the war. And unfortunately, we Jews are on the front lines. And it started for us in France, in Toulouse, right. And it continued. And unfortunately, I will say, what's happened in the Bataclan and in Paris was predictable. And nothing changed. And if we want to put a little bit of Syria and the revolution in the Arab countries, but the fact is we have thousands of radical Islamists which has decided to fight against the freedom, against the war, which is different from them. They hate a part of the world, and what has been done the past years against those people, I will not say that I feel a lot of things has been done. Yesterday, the Prime Minister Valls has decided to be much more looking about the mosque preach, about those 4,000 people with what we know that radical Islamists. That is the issue. It's a Third World War, and it's ideologies, it's radical Islamists, and it will not end with just fighting against Assad or the Daesh in this region.
I want us to actually turn to London now, where we are, as I said, joined by Sheikh Dr. Usama Hassan, a senior researcher at the Islamic Society at the Quilliam Research Center in the UK. I want to thank you very much, Dr. Hassan, for being with us this morning. I do not know if this is the war of civilizations. I find it all very terrifying. And I have to ask you, when it comes to Muslims around Europe, because I think it's very, very important to stress over the course of this morning and the day after the attack. Not all Muslims are radicals, and not everybody targeted by them are Jews. I mean, it seems to be by radical Islam. But at this point in time, do you fear for the Muslim community?
Good morning. Well,
good morning.
Thanks for having me on. There is a lot of fear in Muslim communities in the UK and in France. I've seen many social media messages urging people, especially women, Muslim women, not to travel alone, not to go out unnecessarily even. People expressing fear about taking their children to the park or going shopping even, right, for fear of being attacked. And there are anecdotal reports of Muslim women, again, being attacked in Britain and in France, mosques being attacked. So unfortunately, there is this level of fear. But I agree entirely with what your previous guest said, and I think we should state it even more strongly. The overwhelming majority of Muslims all over the world are appalled and sickened by all of this. And it is precisely a clash of civilized people against uncivilized people. It's not a clash of civilizations. Right. It's a clash of the civilized world, which I believe Islam, Christianity, Judaism, all the major world religions have helped to build the civilized world, and we are facing this terrible threat from immature, uncivilized, barbaric people who respect no civilized values or international state structures or anything like that. They are non-state actors, such as ISIS.
Right.
And the vast majority of Muslims in France, actually, and in Britain, do want to integrate more. They are part of the culture. It was the Muslim security guard at the Stade de France who stopped one of the suicide bombers, for example, and was injured in that attack. And but unfortunately, we have to deal with the problem of extremism and of anti-Semitism, because although Jews were not directly targeted, I'm told that the Bataclan concert hall is actually Jewish-owned, and you'll find on YouTube protests against the Bataclan over the last few years for hosting Israeli musicians, for example. So we do have to deal with this problem of anti-Semitism and extremist ideology. But it is civilized people against uncivilized people, unfortunately.
Rather than religion versus religion. And Pierre, if you're hearing this, I'm asking you because there is also the argument that the Muslim community in France, just like in some ways also the Jewish communities, that minorities have not been integrated to a certain degree, and then animosities, people get upset. Yes. Integration on the part of the French.
Yes. Again, I fully agree when I'm talking about a clash of civilization. I'm not talking about a religion against another religion at all. I mean, it's clear. It's people who don't share the same values of the world where we are living, where we expect our children are going to live. It's clear. In France and other countries, it's population which has not been well integrated, well educated, and they are hating the others, hating the Jews, or hating just the woman, hating
lack of
the
integration
others.
Leads to a lot of
It means the problem is really much more deeper than what we just can consider the issue again of Daesh or the issue of the other conflict in the world. The issue is thousands of people which are today fighting against our world because they don't share our values. And what we saw in Bataclan or the other place, it's just barbare. I don't know how we say.
Barbare.
That's it. It's not the same civilization as the civilization where we grew up. That's what can we do? It's not just thinking that bombing Syria or fighting in Iraq will be the solution. It's an internal solution that, unfortunately, I don't know how to solve today the problem, which is very complex and can be for many years.
Sadly, none of us seem to know how to solve this at this point. But I want to thank you very much for being here, and also Dr. Osama Hassan of the Islamic Society at the Quilliam, Senior Researcher at the Islamic Society at the Quilliam Research Center. Do keep safe, because I think a lot of emotions are going to be flying all over the place. I want to thank you for being here this morning. You are locked in because we're going to go back to social media and tell you're not going anywhere. But no, do sit down. We're not done.
You want to,
yeah, completely. Yeah. But because I think the battle of all of this, or actually the way people reacted over the course of the weekend, was mostly in the sphere of the social media. That's where we wage other wars.
Yeah, as we saw in that report that we had earlier about social media and how it was used, there were also ways that social media was used, I guess, in a very negative way, of course, and that is when it comes to rumors. As we can see from this headline from BuzzFeed, social media rumors about the Paris attacks that you shouldn't believe. This one is a picture of a post that kind of says that there was a screenshot that we have that shows which circulated in the aftermath of attacks, supposedly showing a post from November 5th that was predicting the attacks that would kill more than 100 people in Paris. Yeah. And it is not. It was actually photoshopped. It did not show anything like that. The next thing that we have is there were rumors that a fire broke out in the jungle migrant camp in Calais, which is on the border between France and England, and they were saying that this was a revenge attack as a revenge for the Paris terror. But of course, this did not. Nobody could confirm this. It was just there are occasional fires in that migrant camp, and this was not a revenge attack. Another thing that happened that was actually quite interesting was a tweet of Donald Trump that was circulating.
Yeah.
We can show a picture of that one.
Please.
And the tweet was, isn't it interesting that the tragedy in Paris took place in one of the toughest gun control countries in the world, which actually brought a response from Gérard Araud, the French ambassador in Washington. He said, this message is repugnant in its lack of any human decency. He is a vulture. But the problem is that tweet that Donald Trump wrote was from January 7th. It was written after the attacks on Charlie Hebdo. And somehow it kind of resurfaced, as it sometimes happens on Twitter. The tweets kind of resurface, and the French ambassador
If someone retweets
then it comes up. Yeah.
So the French ambassador actually deleted his tweet that he wrote. But actually, it was a good answer, because not long after that, Trump actually pretty much said the same things in a rally, which we just saw. He said the exact same thing.
He had the same feelings. Yes.
A lot of course, media in America was tackling this, and we're going to take a look of a clip of the Colbert Show, Stephen Colbert, who actually taped his show while before things were happening, and at the end of the taping, they finally found out what was going on in France, and this is what he had to say when he found out.
Folks, we end tonight's show with a heavy heart because we taped all of tonight's show, and then we found out about the horrific attacks in Paris today. I know that not much is known right now. We do know there have been many deaths, and the crisis is still ongoing. President Hollande has declared a state of emergency, and President Obama has promised the United States will do whatever it takes to bring those terrorists to justice. We add our thoughts and prayers to everyone in Paris. And now, we'll see you on Monday.
Yeah.
Good night. Saturday Night Live also paid a tribute on a Saturday night, of course. Instead of doing that usual cold opening that they do before every show.
Yeah, I just think I think it's interesting. I mean, I'm stopping for a second that this horrific acts happen on the weekend, and I think for us in the news media, we know what that spells. It's usually lower staffed, it's usually slightly empty, and the weekend is for the satire and comedy shows. And you have all these people having to give statements. They're dealing with hardcore news. Yes.
Yeah. So we have a clip of the opening moment of Saturday Night Live, where one of the comedians spoke in both English and French. Let's just take a few seconds to see that.
Take a look.
Paris is the city of light, and here in New York City, we know that light will never go out. Our love and support is with everyone there tonight. We stand with you. Paris, c'est la ville lumière. Ici à New York City, nous savons que cette lumière ne s'éteindra jamais.
Yeah. Very emotional. Some other victims of this attack were actually, of course, on the web. A Sikh man named Virendir Jubal, who suddenly, like these tweets that suddenly resurfaced, someone photoshopped an old picture of him that he took in his bathroom. Let's see this picture, where he is holding an iPad.
We don't have it. Sorry.
We don't have
it.
Well, poor guy was photoshopped holding an iPad when he was in the bathroom. They turned that iPad into a Quran, and they put a suicide belt around him, and they said that this is one of the Paris bombers. And of course, this guy just lives in Canada, and he's contemplating suing everybody now because of this.
And
Ann Coulter, the extreme right-wing pundit in the United States, went on a crazy Twitter rant on Friday night, and she let's see one of these tweets that she put on.
Let's take a look. Okay.
Do we have that?
Do we have that? Well, maybe not. We might.
Well, basically, she said that they can wait if they like until next November for the actual balloting. But Donald Trump was elected president last night.
Oh my God. Okay,
Yes.
Ami, I want to thank you for that. We're going to go back to Paris right now. Okay, where Jonathan Sachadati is standing by. I-24 News European correspondent. Jonathan, good morning. I want to ask you, because one of the striking images that I saw overnight coming out is this vigil that was carried out yesterday. It was also in our report, and then a false alarm and people fleeing in panic. Is that the sense in Paris, the city of lights, the city we all want to go on vacation at? What is the sense this morning when the 3 days of mourning are over?
Things are on a knife edge here. I mean, sometimes people want to panic because they hear there's been another incident like thing you mentioned last night, where they evacuated here, and also outside the Bataclan, where we were reporting, the same thing happened. The police cleared the crowd immediately because there were scares that there was more shooting. Everyone's tense, but at the same time, as the schools are reopening and people are trying to go back about their everyday lives, the main thing is people want to keep calm and show that they won't let this change their way of life. In the meantime, behind the scenes, there have been 150 raids in the last 24 hours in the manhunt looking for the terrorists who were behind this attack, those who helped with the logistics, and including this one man who actually escaped after the police stopped the vehicle he was in and then let him go on across the border into Belgium. We will also see later today a joint congressional meeting, which is a very rare thing here, so that both houses of the French Parliament will meet together to be addressed by the president. The last time this happened was President Sarkozy in 2009, that the two chambers met once to be addressed by the president, and then before that it actually hasn't happened since the 1700s. So this gives you an idea of how seriously France is taking what's happened.
No, Jonathan, very much so, and Jonathan Sachadodi will be covering the events, the aftermath of these horrific attacks over the course of the weekend from Paris, France. For I-24 News, to all my esteemed colleagues and friends in the studio, I want to thank you for being with me this morning. A very tough morning after this weekend. Europe seems to be under attack. Let's hope we're going to look at a quieter week. And of course, stay with I-24 News. Check us out on all those social networks, and stay with I-24 News for the rest of the day.